Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everyone. My name is Reese Garcia, and I am the Research Advocacy Manager here at Fight Colorectal Cancer. Thank you all for joining today's webinar on drug types, including biosimilars, genetics, and more. First, I want to thank Michael Sola, Sharon Worrell, and the whole communications team for their support on getting this webinar on the ground. And today, we are excited to have Stevan Lalich from CVS Health. There we go. Out of Illinois. So if you can all see my screen, we're going to have time for questions at the end. On the right side of your GoToWebinar portal, you'll see a questions section, and you're able to type your questions throughout the presentation there. And then towards the end, we'll have time to answer as many as we can. Let's see, you can also watch the webinar afterwards at fightcrc.org/webinar. That will be recorded and posted sometime after today. And then if you are able to tweet along, you can follow us on Twitter using the hashtag CRCWebinar. And then after the webinar, you should see an email with links to the material and a survey. And then if you send that survey back, we will send you a Fight CRC bracelet. Okay, so just a little background on the technology for today. We are using the GoToWebinar platform. Like I said, you can ask questions in the sidebar. That's over in this section right here. And we will try to address as many questions as we can, depending on time and quantity, as well as relevancy. Let's see here. We have a variety of resources, as usual, our Tabooty podcast, mini magazines, and your guide in the fight. So those are always great to check out after these webinars. And then just a quick disclaimer, the information and services provided by Fight Colorectal Cancer are for general information purposes only. The information and services aren't intended to be substitutes for professional medical advice, diagnoses, or treatment. If you're ill or suspect that you are ill, see a doctor immediately. And in an emergency, call 911 or go to the nearest emergency room. Fight CRC never recommends or endorses any specific physicians, products, or treatments for any condition. All right, and with that being said, I would like to introduce our speaker for today, Stevan Lalich. He's served in several clinical roles during his tenure at CVS Health. In his current role, he focuses on developing and executing peer strategies, specifically for the oncology therapy class. Prior to his current position, Stevan served as the oncology clinical therapy manager on the specialty manufacturer services team. And his scope of responsibility there focused on clinical oversight of the oncology drug therapy portfolio for the specialty business unit. He's also served as the oncology subject matter expert for the CVS specialty trade team for consultant RFP responses and manufacturer capabilities presentations in an effort to secure access to oncology pipeline assets. Stevan regularly provides oncology-related clinical therapy training across the organization to various audiences as needed, including specialty pharmacy operations, personnel, and oncology prescriber team members. Stevan also obtained his PharmD degree from the University of Illinois and currently resides in Illinois. All right, so with that being said, I'm going to hand it over to Stevan and let him take it away.
Thank you very much, Reese. I appreciate that. And good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending upon where you are in the country. And as Reese alluded to, we will begin our discussion on biosimilars. Then we will go into a little bit more about generic medications, how biosimilars compare and contrast to each other. And then what we'll do towards the end of the discussion, turning gears slightly, talk a little bit about FDA prescribing labels, as well as your actual prescription label when you get medications from your pharmacy, talking a little bit about the information on those various labels, and trying to, my goal at least, is to convey some information to maximize the value of the information that's out there, especially that FDA drug label information that's public knowledge. I will give some website information, how you can look up very detailed information about medications to become very knowledgeable in those areas. So we'll hit each of those topics. Now, before we go into specifically biosimilars, we actually need to just take a step back because we need to actually first talk about what are biologic medications in medicines first to begin with, before we can really get into biosimilars. So what are biologic medicines? They are large, complex molecules, and typically they're coming from living cells. So what does that mean? It could be microorganisms such as bacteria, plant cells, animal cells. They're used really in all aspects of medicine, so treatment, diagnosis, prevention of diseases. And because of the fact that they are large and complex, one of the takeaways from this slide that I want the audience to understand is because of that complexity, and we'll talk more about that complexity, they're very highly sensitive to manufacturing and handling conditions because of how difficult and complex they can be to make. They're almost always injectables, so they're not going to be oral pills that you take. And then lastly, they can either come from specialty pharmacies or non-specialty pharmacies. So when I say non-specialty pharmacy, I'm predominantly referring to your local retail pharmacy that you can walk into, drop off the prescription, and pick up your medicine there face-to-face, whereas a specialty pharmacy are focusing on those more expensive injectable medications in general, not always, but those types of medications where your doctor is probably faxing in a prescription to, again, a specialty pharmacy that you would not visit, you would only interact with telephonically. So more times than not, I would say these kind of medications, probably 2/3 of the time, are obtained through specialty pharmacy, with about 1/3 of the time through non-specialty. And what are some examples of specialty biologics? Things like Avastin, so that's a very common colorectal cancer as well as ovarian cancer medication. Drugs like Epigen, Herceptin, Humira, Neulasta, Remicade, Rituxan. Again, just wanted to give the group an example, a sample set of what drugs constitute biologics. And right now, the spending within the US on biologics is just continuing to increase annually by over 10% each year. So there's more and more of a reliance on these kind of medications because they really are at the forefront of medicine and drug development. And so they really oftentimes represent some of our most promising therapies that we have today. And the one thing I want to point out, just as more of a housekeeping item, you'll see on the subsequent slides, I really wanted to get the group a lot of information, but sometimes that can be information overload. So what you'll see is I have here and highlighted in bold, or you'll see underlined in other slides. Don't necessarily worry about all the content on the slide per se, but really the areas that I call out, because those are really the takeaways that I want to ensure everyone gets. So we just talked about what a biologic agent is. Well, how does that compare to what you'll hear in the industry is a small molecule drug? And so if you're not certain what a small molecule drug, think of your oral medications, your pills, aspirin, blood pressure medicines, cholesterol medicines like your Lipitors and Zocors or things like that. Drugs that can be taken in a pill form are generally considered quote unquote small molecule drugs. Why are they called that? It's because the chemistry behind those drugs, it's fairly simple in terms of it's not a long molecule. And in this case, I have an example here of aspirin. It's in terms of size, and the molecule of aspirin is 180 Daltons, and Daltons is just a unit of measure. The most important thing is the number of 180. Well, then you look on the other side, on the far right column, a biologic agent like Avastin, which is 150,000 Daltons. So the takeaway here is how vastly different the size of a small molecule drug is to a biologic, 150,000 versus 180. And so you can see a drug like aspirin, chemically, the structure, very small, very simple, very well characterized, very stable, very easy to replicate. And that'll make more sense of why I say that later. Whereas a biologic, it's large, it's a protein, it's complex, it's unstable in the form of, I want people to understand when I say unstable, that means that you make one batch of a biologic versus the other, it's not going to be 100% the same. It'll be similar enough where it has the same therapeutic benefit, but it will not be a 1-to-1 100% match. And that's where in the kicker statement on the bottom of the slide, unlike small molecules that have generics, biologics cannot be exactly replicated. And that has implication as far as why when you make a copy of a biologic drug, it's not a generic, we call it biosimilar because it won't be an exact 100% replication. So that's where the name really biosimilar comes from. And before we kind of delve into some of the nuances of biosimilars, one more slide to just further reiterate the difference between a small molecule drug versus a biologic. Again, small molecule being drugs like your blood pressure, cholesterol medicines, aspirin, oral pills, versus a biologic that is usually an injectable with product. This, hopefully you guys can see this chart on the bottom, or this diagram I should say. This large and very complex molecule, I know it's kind of small in terms of the picture. This is a monoclonal antibody, which most biologics are. This is the level of complexity for that versus what you see circled here. This is truly the right ratio. This is how complex aspirin is versus this is what a monoclonal antibody is. Again, I'm just trying to hit home the point of the vast difference in what it takes to make a product like aspirin versus a biologic. And what you see in the title of the slide, the bicycle versus an F-16 fighter jet, I once had a clinical consultant who is a physician by trade give me that analogy when describing these two types of products. And it's always stuck with me. I think it's a great example where if I'm trying to manufacture a bike, okay, I probably can do that. And a lot of people can do that with the right, parts. There's no way in heck I could ever build an F-16 fighter jet. I mean, that's something that very few individuals and companies have the technology and sophistication to be able to do. So what exactly is a biosimilar? And this is from the FDA in their definition. A biosimilar is a biologic product, which we've been talking about, that is highly similar to and has no clinically meaningful differences from an existing FDA-approved biologic reference product. So I highlighted the key elements of that definition. Again, highly similar, it's not exact, but it's similar enough in that there is no clinically meaningful differences, so that if you take a biosimilar versus taking the original drug, which you'll hear me call it the reference product. The reference product is basically the original brand name drug that was originally FDA approved in how it compares to the biosimilar. So again, to reiterate, small molecule drugs have generics because generics are exact replicas. There is no chemical difference. So that's required to be deemed a generic. Biologics do not have generics. Biologics, like a drug like Avastin, have biosimilars. And because they are similar, and they're, in this case, biosimilar, and they're not generics, they are not directly substitutable at your pharmacy. And so we'll talk more about that, but one of the key things is that a biosimilar cannot be dispensed by the pharmacy unless they get and speak to the physician who wrote the prescription and basically change it to specifically the biosimilar. So if you had a prescription for Avastin sent into your pharmacy, you have to, and there is no additional outreach by the pharmacy to your doctor, they absolutely by law have to dispense Avastin. They can't just switch it. Like, I'm sure all of us have gone to your local retail pharmacy with a prescription, let's say for an antibiotic that has a generic. Oftentimes, when you go to pick up the prescription, because the doctor didn't say there was any issue with substituting, you wind up getting a generic. They cannot do that with these medications. So that's a key call out. So what is an example of, when I say, on the previous slide going back, no clinically meaningful differences? So what exactly is a clinically insignificant difference? And this chart, hopefully, or this diagram gives an example. So here are two molecules. One is the reference product, and then this is the copy or the biosimilar product. As you can see, kind of comparing and contrasting the shapes, the colors, and the various pieces of the product, very similar, right? And the only difference in this case is on the biosimilar. This chain is 2 units long, whereas on the reference product, it's 5 units long. But in this particular drug example, the active part of the drug that is actually having an impact on the body is this section here. Hopefully you guys can see what I'm circling on the top part. And you can see it's exactly the same. So the fact that this other part of what we call the tail end of the chain is slightly different, it's insignificant because that's an inactive component of the product. So for example, the FDA would not be concerned with that because in understanding how the drug works, the area where there's difference is not clinically active and a driver of how the drug works. So a difference like that would be allowable. So hopefully that gives an example where a minor difference between the reference product and the proposed biosimilar is acceptable because it's in an inactive part of the molecule. And a little bit on the development and the research and all the activities that are necessary to bring the products to market. I don't want to go through all of these details, but the key point here is that on the Innovator product, so the product that is being built from scratch, it's a brand new entity. There's nothing on the market like it. That has to go through very rigorous, in this upside down pyramid, very rigorous clinical trial data. As we all are familiar with, we see commercials for drugs that are going through clinical trials, things like that. Phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 have to go through years and years of clinical trials to prove safety and efficacy. However, for a biosimilar manufacturer that's applying to the FDA to get approval, you can see the pyramid is quite different. There's really not a lot of clinical studies because essentially the brand or the biologic application on this side, the chemical has already been proven to be safe and effective. So what does the FDA require the biosimilar applicant to do? It's all about analytics and showing that the biosimilar displays that similarity to the Innovator product. So the big step for the biosimilar is to show to prove to the FDA that this product is very similar to the original product in that any differences that do exist are insignificant. There's no need to go through rigorous clinical trials because that's already been done by the reference product. And again, if the FDA required clinical trials, in-depth clinical trials, you're taking away from the value of a biosimilar, which is we can get more products on the market in a quicker time frame that will then drive competition and hopefully lower the cost of these drugs. That's the ultimate goal, is to get the consumer a similar, basically the same type of clinical treatment, but at a lower cost. And so I want to talk briefly about, you've heard me hammer home the point about biosimilars cannot be automatically substituted at the pharmacy and dispensed unless the doctor specifically asks for that biosimilar. You can't get a brand name drug prescription and have the pharmacy just automatically convert to the biosimilar. Now, there is a designation that the FDA has developed that I can tell you no drug yet, and we'll go through the list of FDA-approved biosimilars on the market today. None of them has the designation of interchangeable product. They're biosimilars, but they're not interchangeable biosimilars. But I just wanted the group to know that we may see a time where a manufacturer actually goes down the approval path to be deemed interchangeable. And what's the difference? Well, to go down this path, the manufacturer has to go through additional requirements and show that an even higher level of analysis is done to show that the reference product is even more similar to the brand product through these additional requirements. Why would a manufacturer do that? It's what the second sub-bullet is getting at. an interchangeable product, so if a drug is given that designation, in that situation, it could be substituted for the reference drug without asking the doctor for permission because these additional requirements have been met. Again, I want to just reinforce, no drug yet has come to the market with this status, but it is an option out there. So we may see a drug and a manufacturer pursue this status. And only if it has this status would it be potentially interchangeable at the pharmacy level directly without the doctor's consent. My personal opinion, from my experience in knowing what these additional requirements are, I do not foresee drug manufacturers taking the extra time, effort, and millions of dollars to do additional testing to get a drug on market to get this additional status. And that's why the products that we've seen come to market, to get them onto market quicker, the manufacturers are content with just having the biosimilar status. This table, I don't think we're going to go through in much detail, but this is essentially to look at, this is the legislature that's out there that the government has put out on what is needed for a biosimilar and then what is needed for to be deemed as a biosimilar versus an interchangeable biologic product. And I just highlighted in red, this is the language from the FDA, is that if you're interchangeable and you get this designation, you may be substituted for the reference product by a pharmacist without intervention by the prescribing provider. So what we have on the market today are biosimilars, and biosimilars does not imply that they can directly be interchangeable. So a lot of people actually look at biosimilars as almost like another brand name drug because you can't substitute one with the other. But generally they are at a lower cost. So are biosimilars the same as generic drugs? No. Biosimilars and generics are versions of brand name drugs and generally are more affordable options to patients, but they go through completely different approval pathways through the FDA. But one of the key things is the active ingredients of a generic drug are exactly the same as those of a brand name. Whereas by contrast, the biosimilar manufacturer must show that it is highly similar, except in minor differences can be allowed, but they won't be exactly the same. So generics, 100% exact copies. Biosimilars are not 100% the same, but they are highly similar with no clinical impact with those differences. Naming conventions for biosimilars. So the FDA, and the FDA honestly has kind of gone back and forth, and it's kind of been a wild ride in terms of how they've deemed what the naming of the product should be. So the biosimilars generally will have their own, they'll even have a brand name, and we'll get to that in the next slide. But in terms of like the generic name, what the FDA has said is that the core name of the biosimilar, the generic, has to be this part that's in orange. That is shared. That part of the name is shared with the brand name drug. What's different to make it distinct from the brand product is this hyphenated suffix that you see. It's 4 characters. There's no recognizable meaning. These are honestly basically randomized letters, and they're all in lowercase. But the reason why they're doing this is, so like this first product here is a drug called Humira. So Humira's generic name is adalimumab, but to not confuse adalimumab with the biosimilar, they tack on this suffix. So whenever you see, the take-home message is, whenever you see this suffix added to the end of the chemical name, you will know that it is referring to the biosimilar and not the reference brand product. But there's enough information here to know the correlation, because this is a common element with the brand drug. This makes it distinct for the biosimilar. A little confusing, but I thought that's something that the team or the group should be aware of. So what FDA-approved biosimilars do we have on the market? This is the list, and this is the list I pulled as of just late last week. So these are all the agents that have been FDA approved. Now, a couple of things you'll see here. And I highlighted, from a colorectal cancer perspective, the biosimilar for Avastin has been FDA approved as of September. And perfect example of what we were just talking about, that's bevacizumab, but it has this hyphenated AWWB. And that, again, distinctly calls it out and differentiates it from the brand Avastin. Now, what you see these manufacturers of the biosimilars are doing is there's not just this generic name, but they've also branded it as Mavasi. So most people, I would think, doctors, colleagues, friends and family members that are talking about drugs within this space, they'll probably refer to it as Mavasi versus getting into the more technical chemical name. Now, you see that I have it listed here September 2017. You're probably thinking to myself, wait a minute, I've not heard anybody talk about taking this medication. My doctor hasn't recommended that I go on it. Well, that's because even though it's been FDA approved, it's not available to use yet. And the reason for that is the biosimilar manufacturer got FDA approval, which is a huge victory for them. However, the manufacturers of the brand name Avastin, in this example, they still have a patent on the drug. So it has not expired. So this manufacturer cannot bring this drug to market yet. Otherwise, it'd be patent infringement and there'd be legal issues between the makers of Avastin and the makers of Mavasi. Hopefully that makes sense. So this is more the clinical approval has been granted. And now this manufacturer is basically waiting in the background, and the day that the patent for Avastin expires, they can then market their product and have it available for patients and doctors. And that's the case for a lot of these drugs on this list. I just called this one out because it is a colorectal cancer product, but a lot of these, like the third one, Erelzi, that's a biosimilar for Enbrel, which is for rheumatoid arthritis. But that one is, even though it was approved last year, it's still not on the market because of legal patent issues. But I just wanted to let you know that the FDA has actually clinically approved all of these products. We touched on some of this already, but what's the impact of biosimilars to the marketplace? The most important thing from a consumer standpoint, it creates more competition. I mean, just basic economics, right? You have a drug, and I keep using Avastin just as one example. You have a drug like Avastin, and you have a set of patients that need this drug, and the manufacturer of that drug, basically can control a lot of the cost of that because there's no competition. I mean, there's a demand for it, and they're the only manufacturers of that product. And so, unfortunately, we do see these high prices. So then now, let's say in end of 2019, when we have the biosimilar hit the market, well, now there's competition because now the patients and doctors alike will have an option to go with the biosimilar potentially. And so then what we're hopeful of, that competition between two products should lead to lower drug prices. One, the biosimilar will likely hit the market at a lower price in respect to the brand name. And then from a consumer perspective, what we hope is, okay, well then to not lose market share, we're hoping that the brand manufacturer then also lowers their prices, and that there's a pricing war in the favor of the consumer where the prices continue to go lower. Now, the one thing that's interesting, within the US, adoption of biosimilars as a whole across therapy classes has been fairly low to date. I think it's largely due to both physician and patient uncertainty about biosimilars. That's why we're having this discussion today, really to help educate the consumer out there and patients out there in terms of what really biosimilars are, how they compare to biologics that they're based upon, as well as how they differ from what we traditionally consider generic drugs. And hopefully that education brings awareness that these are viable options. There is better adoption in that, and it can be definitely a cost savings opportunity within the healthcare system. And it's interesting because when you look at data, which I look at just part of my job, and looking at a lot of clinical research and literature out there, a lot of our European counterpart countries have strongly adopted biosimilars. I mean, sometimes to the tune of 70, 80, 90% of a chemical of a drug is being utilized in the biosimilar form versus the brand name form. And sometimes the government policies can have something to do with that, where there's a lot more centralized health, where government can basically dictate we want the lowest cost option, and thus they're going towards biosimilars, and they're seeing great results with that. So that it's, again, a little bit different from what we see here in the US. Now, a lot of the information that I presented to you on biosimilars is actually listed on this website, and I think it's actually a good FDA website. It does have a lot of information, but they do have stuff that's in patient-friendly format. So I would definitely advise, if anyone's interested to learn more about biosimilars or to revisit a lot, because we've talked about a lot in a very short amount of time on biosimilars, to definitely check out this website. So now what we're going to do is we're going to switch gears off of biosimilars and talk about FDA drug label information and kind of give an overview of how to read a drug label. And the funny thing is about a drug label, and even within my work environment, we call this 10 different things. People call it the PI, they call it a package insert, they call it the prescribing information. It all refers to the same document. So in case anyone gets confused, because you will hear, doctor, you probably have 10 doctors and you'll have 5 call it a package insert, 5 call it a prescribing information. It is the same single document. And we're going to go through an actual sample of, it's a mock drug, but I want to go through the important sections. And my tip, because the document can be large, it's in like size 6 font, there's a lot of information overload. What I do, and I probably read 5 or 10 of these a day, just part of my work and my responsibilities, always start with the initial section that's titled Highlights of Prescribing Information, because it's really the Cliff Notes version of the document. It's usually 1/2 to maybe 1-page summary of all of the key information in a summarized fashion. And then if there's something that you want to review in more detail, maybe the side effects or the clinical trials, then the body of the package insert, I would then go to those specific sections to get that more detailed info. But start off with this section, because even for my line of work, being a clinical pharmacist, I'll probably say 80% of the information I need to know or look up on a drug quickly, I can get in just this highlighted section. I need to know what's the dosing, what dosage forms does it come in, what are the approved uses, what are the side effects I should be worried about. All that, for the most part, can be obtained from this initial section. And though that initial section provides things such as what are called black box warnings, and we'll go through all these in detail. This is the information on the subsequent slides. But what are the warnings for use? What indications? Indications are the approved uses. What's the dosing? How is it administered? Is it by mouth? Is it IV? What are the available dosage forms? When should it never be used, which is contraindications? What are warnings and precautions? What are side effects, or also known as adverse reactions? And are there any recommendations for use in special populations? So if a patient's pregnant, maybe they have kidney or liver issues, all that is generally called out in the highlight section. And I apologize on this next slide. I know the size of the font is very small, but try to get it all in one screen. But this is it. And you can see a lot of what I just talked about: indications, dosage, contraindications, warnings. All of that at a very high level is captured here in this black box warning. The reason why it's called black box is because it's highlighted in a box to have a specific call out. All that is here. And then, as I mentioned, if there's certain areas you want to delve into further, you can then go to generally the next 10, 20, 30 pages of the document to get to that very detailed view. I will state, though, this, and the FDA has explicitly stated this document is really for the prescriber. This is for a physician-level audience for a majority of the document. There then is, hopefully you can see in the bottom right, patient counseling information and patient labeling information. So there is a section that is more at the patient literacy level that I always recommend patients review that, because it gives tips on how to take the medicines, what side effects to be on the lookout for, what to report to your doctor if certain side effects happen, which are more mild, which are considered indicative of more significant issues that need to be, where you need to alert your physician. So probably 90% of this document is really written for a physician and about 10% for the patient. But I can tell you that my own family members always review a lot of the more clinical and physician level documentation, because they want to know more about the medications they're taking, which I totally understand it, and hence the reason why I want to give this overview. So now we're going to go through these sections. The first section, very straightforward. The highlights, and this kind of works from left to right. The highlights of the prescribing information, basically this is almost like a disclaimer that it doesn't include all the information, and this is a mock drug indicon. But basically, this is just stating that this is not an all-inclusive list of information. The next section gives the actual drug name, including the dosage form, so in this case, capsules, and when was the drug originally approved. Here is the warning section, also known as the black box warning section. Not every drug has this section. I would probably say only 1 in 5 to maybe 1 in 6 drugs actually has a warning. But when the FDA is evaluating a drug to approve it, if there are very significant warnings, they make the distinction or determination of whether or not this additional call out is needed. So if you are on a drug that has this section, this is definitely an area to take and pay close attention to, because it may not be a common side effect, but if it's listed, it means that if it does occur, it could be life-threatening and very significant, or cause hospitalization. So something definitely to be mindful of. I would always read this section, again, if it applies to the drug you're taking. These package inserts are updated regularly by the manufacturer. And whenever, and I would say regularly, it depends upon if there's any notable changes or major changes. If there's not major changes, it may only be updated once a year. If there's major changes every 3 months, it may be updated 3-4 times a year. And since the last change, this little section here will tell you what sections had an update and on what date that occurred. And I always like to look at that to see what is recently changed with the drug, especially if the drug's been on the market 5, 10, 15 years. What are some of the recent changes? And sometimes it's based upon post-marketing information. They learn about more side effects that maybe occurred that they didn't catch during clinical trials and things of that nature. Indications, these are the specific uses that the FDA has said this drug is approved to be used for these uses. And so you can see and these are bulleted out. So, a drug may have 1 use, it may have 5 uses, and they may come over time where a drug initially gets approved for 1 use, and then a year later they do more clinical trials, and now it's approved for 2 uses, 3 uses, 4 uses. So this will always have the running list of approved uses of the drug. The dose and administration, it then talks about by specific use. So in this case, stroke has maybe a different dosage than using it in a coronary stent patient. So it's very specific dosing to the specific use and how it's administered. Is it daily? Is it by mouth? Is it taken with food, without food, things of that nature. How does the drug come? I've had a lot of patients back when I was working in retail pharmacy always ask, I'm taking 2 of the 50 milligram capsules to make 100 milligrams in a day. Could I not just get a 100 milligram capsule? And that's where I would look at a document like this, say, no, unfortunately, the manufacturer does not make it in a 100 milligram capsule. That's the reason why you have to take 2 pills each day to reach that total daily dosage. But this would be a section that you could look for that kind of information. Contraindications, again, these are the lists of scenarios where if you have any of these particular issues, you should not be using this drug at all. There shouldn't be really any exceptions. Now, warnings and precautions are potentially issues that can come up and what you should do. And what I mean by that is, so if it maybe there be blood levels of a certain, like maybe it would cause you to be anemic. It's a good example. Now, the warning section will say anemia is a risk, but then it also will tell you that how your doctor should monitor for this. And so in this example, this is very similar I see in a lot of drugs. See where it says monitor for hematologic adverse reactions every 2 weeks through the third month of treatment. If you're on this particular, I know this is a fake drug, but if you were on this drug and you were not getting a blood test every 2 weeks when you first started therapy, I would definitely call your doctor and say, wait a minute, this drug is telling me I should be getting monitored for this issue, and I'm not getting blood work, and ensure that there wasn't some kind of a gap in the treatment plan, because that's something that the FDA really only lists these monitoring parameters, as we call them, unless they're absolutely needed. So, those would be things to call your doctor about. Adverse reactions, these are simply the side effects. And normally what they list are the most common side effects. So you may have something that happened in 1 out of 1 million patients, may not be listed here. Generally, it'll be something where at least, let's say, this says 2%. I've seen where manufacturers list, okay, at least 5 to 10% of the population experiences these side effects, and they will be listed there. Drug interactions, pretty self-explanatory, but if there are drugs that interact with this product, they will be listed here. And again, you could go to the later section of the document to be able to look at detailed information on the specific drug interaction. In use in specific populations, as I alluded to, if there are hepatic impairment, means that if you have any issues with your liver function, and renal impairment means if you have any issues with your kidney function. If this drug needs to have maybe a lower dosing, if you have those types of issues, it would be listed in this section. So again, generally kidney, liver, pregnancy, pediatrics or children, and then as well as geriatric considerations, so those, let's say, over 65 or 70. If there are specific call-outs that the drug needs to be taken in a different manner for those specific populations, this would be where they'd be called out in. And as I mentioned, even though there's really not a lot of info on this summary, always read the patient counseling information. It's a great read. It's usually 1 or 2 pages. It doesn't take too long. So this is almost like a table of contents of what that detailed section would look like. So we just talked about the high level of each of the sections, but if you actually go to a drug interaction section, there's a paragraph or more on each and every single drug that interacts, or all the warnings and things of that nature. So that's how this document can very quickly become a 20 to 30 page document because of all of this detail behind it. Now, if you are interested in looking at this information, I would definitely bookmark this link here, and we'll make certain you guys get this. This is a really nice and user-friendly electronic format to look at the package inserts. The reason why I like it, and I use this honestly 5 times a day at least, is I don't have to sift through a PDF and go through 30 pages. It's actually electronically indexed. So if I just click on, I want to just look at drug interactions, it'll just show me drug interactions. It'll just show me what's the dosage. So it's very nicely, as I call it, electronically indexed to just get me to the information I want to see in a clean format. And every single FDA-approved drug is available on that website. And it even shows images of the drug packaging. So if you want to know what the package would look like for Avastin or Neupogen, you'd have all that information there. So then lastly, and I just have one slide, how to read a prescription label. So instead of looking at the drugs label, meaning the information that the FDA requires the manufacturer have available on the drug, now this is simply the label that your pharmacy will put onto your prescription. And even though we're talking a lot about biologics and drugs that probably go through specialty pharmacy, it doesn't change the fact that, legally, I don't care if you're getting a basic antibiotic at your retail pharmacy or getting one of these biologics from a specialty pharmacy that gets mailed to you. The prescription label has to have the same core elements by law on each and every one of the prescriptions. And So what we have illustrated here, very basic example, and your label may have more information than this, but at a minimum, again, from a pharmacy law perspective, it has to have these components. It has to have the pharmacy name and the information so that you clearly know, and including a phone number to be able to call in for refills, questions about your medication, has the doctor information, a very clear prescription number, when it was filled, your information, including address, how to take the medicine, the quantity, and then the number of allowable refills, and not only the number of refills, but by what date, because it's not just in 6 refills for eternity, it's 6 refills, let's say for the next 6 months or 12 months, as well as an expiration on the medication. So again, this information may be rearranged in a different format on your pharmacy's particular label, but at a minimum, each of these items should be there. And hopefully this is just a helpful to kind of describe, what are each of these components and what do they represent. And then lastly, there actually is one last section, questions about prescription drug therapy. Now, I've been working from a CVS perspective, just to give background, and that's why my focus has been on specialty pharmacy for these complex drugs, especially within oncology, is really, it has been specialty pharmacy. So some of the questions that I get are, I'm probably a little bit more biased on the questions that a specialty pharmacy gets versus retail, but I'll kind of delineate that in a moment. So what do you do if you have a question about your medicine? If it is an emergency situation, always contact your doctor or call 911 first or go to an emergency room. You wouldn't want to contact your pharmacy if it's truly an emergency situation, because they will only be routing you to call 911 or call your doctor. So you would just be adding in an additional step in, which again, time is of the essence if it's an emergency situation. But now if it's a non-emergency situation, if you're just wondering if, let's say, and I'm thinking about a lot of like oral oncology medicines, if it causes mild persistent nausea or diarrhea, and you want to know if you're experiencing that, is my drug doing that? That's something that definitely the pharmacy can do. And I always recommend, if you get a technician or a non-pharmacist that answers the phone, which is commonly the case, just always ask to speak to the pharmacist. You want that clinician to be answering this question versus the technician. They should be doing that anyway, but be certain you are speaking to a pharmacist or a nurse if that particular pharmacy has nurses on staff. And if you are getting your medicine from a specialty pharmacy, I highly recommend that if you have a question like that, in terms of, is this side effect being caused by my particular drug, always call your specialty pharmacy and not your retail pharmacy. And absolutely nothing against the retail pharmacy staff, but normally the way the teams are set up at specialty pharmacy is you are not only getting a pharmacist, but you are getting let's say an example of a cancer drug, you would be routed to an oncology focused and trained pharmacist. Whereas a retail pharmacist, and I was one of those 10 years ago, you are a generalist. You have to know a little bit about everything from blood pressure, diabetes, antibiotics. You may have a couple of cancer patients, but you're really not a specialist per se in that particular medicine. So again, if you are getting a specialty medication or using a specialty pharmacy to get your medicine, even though it may be more convenient to call your retail pharmacist, I would suggest reaching out to your specialty pharmacy because they likely are going to be more knowledgeable in that particular therapy category. And what are some of the side effects that, again, from a specialty pharmacy perspective that I've commonly seen? It's, again, what we just talked about. Is the side effect that I'm experiencing coming from my drug? And if so, what can I do to address? And they can give tips such as, like, let's say nausea is an issue. They can recommend, if it's mild, an over-the-counter medication that you can get your local pharmacy. If it's more severe, and they'll ask questions, how severe is your nausea, or if you're having diarrhea, how severe. If it's moderate to severe, they will tell you to go to your doctor. You may need something more than an over-the-counter medication, and they may want to see you. The other thing that the pharmacy can commonly help with that I feel like sometimes patients don't take advantage of is there financial support for your medication? Especially with high-cost specialty pharmacy drugs. Specialty pharmacies, all of them, can help find manufacturer copay assistance or grant money that's available to you from foundations. Both are options that can significantly reduce your out-of-pocket spend burden for these medications. Another question that commonly comes up, I'm not feeling any better or different as I've been taking this medicine. Is it working? And a lot of these medications, you may not necessarily feel any different. Sometimes you may feel worse. And what I mean by that is it may be working on the condition, but it's causing all these side effects. And so patients sometimes will be, well, why am I taking this if it makes me feel worse? But that's an important area where it's really important to remain adherent, in that, the drug may be keeping your condition in check and not getting worse. So maybe it's like for a cancer medication, yes, you may still have a tumor present, but is that tumor not growing? That's success. That's what the doctor oftentimes in certain clinical situations, that's what they're looking for. This drug is stopping the growth of the cancer. Yes, you may still have the cancer present, but it's not getting any worse. And that's in that particular situation, that may be exactly what the doctor is looking for. But sometimes if you are feeling, let's say, worse, there may be tests that you may need to get done on a regular basis to make certain the drug is working. And that's where the pharmacist can tell you, a drug like Gleevec, you need to go every 3 months to get a blood test, and that's for chronic leukemia. But if the patient says, oh, I've never gotten a blood test for a year, well, that's where a pharmacist can, especially an oncology focused pharmacist would know, yeah, you need to talk to your doctor immediately because there are tests that you should be getting to monitor your progress on therapy to ensure the drug is working accordingly. So those are very common discussions I've had with patients, regarding medications. A lot of information I've conveyed there. That's the end of the presentation. Hopefully, everyone has found this to be beneficial. We will open up for questions now. And if there are questions that we can't get to, please feel free to email me at my email address that I have listed here.
Thank you so much, Steven. That was extremely informative. So like you said, we will now open it up to a Q&A. And so one of the questions that came in kind of on that specialty pharmacy discussion is, what are the options for a patient to choose a specialty pharmacy? How does that process work? Is it something the patient decides, or is it something that they work with their physician to decide?
That is a great question. First off, it's not a straightforward answer. It's a combination of what you just indicated there, Reese, where it's a combination of what I'll basically say 3 factors. And factor 1 generally is the most impactful. And what I mean by that, 3 factors are your insurance. So your prescription insurance oftentimes has a preferred or exclusive specialty pharmacy provider. So if that's the case, let's say it's exclusive, well then unfortunately that your physician and the patient will have to essentially send the prescription to wherever the insurance says we only cover the drug essentially if you send it to this location. So if that's the case, that essentially rules it out. Scenario 2, and this is common as well, the insurance company says you can go to any one of these 3 specialty pharmacies. So then, yes, you can't go to 20 different pharmacies, it's narrowed down to 3, but then it's at the discretion of the physician and the patient talking about those 3 pharmacies. I can tell you in my experience, doctors sometimes have a preference of which pharmacy they think are easier to work with for things like prior authorization to get your drug covered. So they may have a preference within that list of 3. But if you, the patient, have a very specific experience, I liked using Walgreens in the past, specialty pharmacy, and they are a viable option based upon your insurance, let your doctor know that. And I would think 9 times out of 10, they're not going to overrule your decision. So again, insurance largely limits where you can go. And then if there is choice, it is equally decided between the doctor and the patient.
Okay, great, thanks. So then on that note of insurance, I know you said that like the introduction of these biosimilars to the market can ultimately lower costs theoretically, but what has your experience been with insurance companies, either their uptake or, whether or not they're accepting them? What has your experience been?
So my experience, and I can speak to from the, so with my role at CVS Health, I'm not sure if everyone knows, I mean, we're both a pharmacy, so you see our retail pharmacy. We are a specialty pharmacy, but then we're also what's called a PBM, or a pharmacy benefit manager. Basically, we're prescription insurance that a lot of employers, health plans utilize CVS Health to manage basically the prescription insurance. So I have experience, I just wanted to kind of throw that out there, that my answer is kind of based upon my experience internally here within CVS. So we have actually, so one thing we've seen as far as cost, the actual pure cost difference between the brand and the biosimilar, in some cases hasn't been as drastic of a price reduction as we've initially expected. We thought maybe upwards of 40% less expensive for a biosimilar. We're probably seeing within the handful of drugs that are on the market and available, probably in the range of 10 to 30%. So it does have a range. I mean, some are only 10% less expensive than the brand. Some are upwards of 30%. So there is some variation in how much discount. I mean, there is savings. I mean, there always is savings. That's the key point. There always is savings for the biosimilar. What we've done is, in terms of access to those drugs, because we know that there is less, they are less expensive, sometimes from a formulary or drug list, if you will, perspective for your insurance, which is the set of drugs you're allowed to get that are covered by the insurance. Sometimes, and we have done this, we have actually stated the preferred drug is the biosimilar, and that the brand name drug is no longer covered by the insurance. Again, is a method to try to drive cost savings to our clients.
Great, thank you for that. That's very helpful to know, as people might be considering biosimilars and considering the insurance, any issues and barriers they might face with that. So it looks like we might only have time for one more question. So here's one. When and do biosimilars come into play if a person is running out of treatment options?
Well, in terms of running out of treatment options, I think the key thing here is, from a therapeutic perspective, in terms of where they are within a treatment guideline, let's say for a certain cancer type, it's not going to be a new type of treatment per se, right? Because it's mimicking an existing drug on market. So if a patient is running out of options, let's say they're on fourth line treatment for a certain cancer type, if the biosimilar will have the same position within the treatment guidelines as the brand name drug. So what I mean by that is, in my example, let's say you've already used 3 different types of chemotherapy. And if the fourth line option is a drug that is a biologic that has a biosimilar, then in that case, the biosimilar is an option. But if, let's say, I'll use this example, let's say you've used 3 different types of chemotherapy and you're on your fourth line option and you're running out of options. But let's say the biosimilar that comes to market, if that is the biosimilar for a drug you tried as a second line option, this would not become a new option for you, because chemically and just clinically, you've essentially used that same product just in a different format. Hopefully that example makes sense, but it really just gives you a lower cost option that is in the same, it's the same treatment option in terms of line of therapy as the brand name drug. It wouldn't be any different.
Okay, great. Thank you for clarifying that. That was very informative. So it looks like, in the interest of time, we are about done. So once again, thank you so much, Stevan. If any of you all have any questions that you'd like to follow up with him, Stevan's information was on that first slide of his presentation, so feel free to email him your questions. And as always, you can contact us at FightCRC at our toll-free line, or go to fightcrc.org to receive those resources we discussed at the beginning. Thank you, Stevan, once again. again, and have a good day, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.